Every Tuesday at 11 in the morning, a man in a charcoal suit walked into a soup kitchen on Bishop's Row and sat down at the corner table, and nobody who worked there ever asked him why. His name was August Varley. He was 34 years old. He owned most of the shipping that moved through the East Docks, and there were men in that city who wouldn't say his name out loud inside their own homes. He didn't wear a watch. He ate the same lentil soup as everybody else, out of the same chipped bowl, and he watched. He'd been watching for 9 months, and what he watched was a woman nobody else seemed to see. Her name was Maeve Donnelly. She was 27. She'd been sleeping in a broken-down van behind St. Bridget's Cemetery for 4 years, and she had the hands of a craftswoman, because that's exactly what she'd once been, back when she still had a workshop and a husband and a life that made sense. Every morning before dawn, she left a repaired violin on the church steps, tuned, dusted, no note, no name, and she never once stayed around to be thanked. That was all of it. That was why he came. And there were Sloane Vance, 31, platinum bob, nails the color of dark wine, and August's for 14 months. She was beautiful the way a photograph is beautiful, with no wrong angle anywhere on her, and she knew exactly who August was. That's what made her feel safe. She thought his power was a shield she got to wear. She never understood it was a set of rules she was breaking. So when Sloane walked into that soup kitchen on a rainy Tuesday and watched Maeve slip on a wet floor and spill a tray of hot soup down Sloane's white dress, she didn't shout. She smiled at the reporters she'd invited herself. Then she turned to the homeless woman kneeling at her feet, picked a piece of soaked bread up off the floor, held it out between 2 fingers, and told her to eat it where she belonged. 20 people sat in that room. 20 people looked down into their bowls. And what Sloane didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that Maeve had an envelope in her coat pocket with $200 inside it, money she'd earned giving plasma and fixing pawn shop guitars for $30 apiece, money she mailed to a 19-year-old brother who still believed she managed a workshop up in Portland. She knelt because if she fought back she'd lose her meals, and if she lost her meals she'd have to open that envelope. She knelt so her brother could stay in school, and she didn't know, couldn't have known, that the quiet man at the corner table had a mother named Cordelia who died alone in a shelter just like this one, in Providence, more than 20 years ago, and that not one person in that room had stood up for her either. He'd had a rule for 12 years. He didn't step in unless he was asked. Maeve Donnelly had never asked anyone for anything in her whole life. That afternoon, August Varley broke his own rule for the first time, and it cost him 3 shipping contracts, half his crew, and a war with a man named Osgood Trant. He knew it would. He stood up anyway. If this story moves you, hit that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because stories like this one don't come along often. Now let's go back to Bishop's Row, back to that rainy Tuesday morning, back to the moment a woman who owned nothing taught a man who owned everything what dignity actually costs, before the sun had time to rise above the low rooftops of the East Side. Inside the old van parked behind St. Bridget's Cemetery, Maeve's breath had gathered into a thin veil of mist across the glass, and she lay still for a few seconds in the darkness, listening to the city while it was still asleep. On the passenger seat beside her, the unfinished yellow wool blanket she was still knitting had been folded into a neat square, every crease perfectly aligned, as though someone had smoothed it flat the night before. She sat up, pulled the frayed collar of her old military jacket close beneath her chin, then switched on the small flashlight she always kept in the door pocket. Beneath that trembling pool of weak yellow light, she placed an old violin across her lap, its neck broken clean away. The instrument Father DeRoss had quietly left for the church's free music class, and began to work. Her fingers moved with a certainty that no hardship had ever managed to wear away, scraping off the old dried glue, measuring the curve of the neck, first with her eyes, and then with the pad of her thumb, the way someone might search for the heartbeat of a living creature. She didn't hurry. She never hurried with an instrument. She fitted the new piece of wood against the break, turned it 0.5 millimeter, then turned it a little more, until the grain of the repair nearly matched the grain of the violin's body so perfectly that no one would ever know where it had once been wounded unless they bent close enough to look. In that stillness, surrounded by the scent of wood, rosin, and the skin-cutting cold of early morning, Maeve almost became the person she had once been, the woman who'd had a workshop of her own, warm lights, and a life that was still whole, before all of it had been taken from her piece by piece. She tightened the strings, adjusted the pegs, then rested the violin beneath her chin and drew out a single testing note in the darkness. The sound rose clear and full, trembling slightly at the very end before dissolving into the air, and for one brief moment she closed her eyes. It was the closest thing to happiness she allowed herself to have. When the clock on the dashboard showed that it was nearly 5 o'clock, she wiped every trace of dust from the violin's body with a soft cloth, checked the tension of each string one more time, even though she knew they were perfect, then slid the instrument into a faded cloth case. She opened the van door as quietly as she could, stepped out into the cold mist still clinging to the cemetery grass, and walked the familiar blocks leading to the church on Bishop's Row. The street was empty, filled only with the sound of her shoes and the cry of a solitary crow somewhere on a rooftop. When she arrived, she set the violin down neatly on the stone steps, turning its face inward so the damp wouldn't damage the varnish, then straightened and looked at it for a second. She left no note. She didn't write her name. She pulled up her hood and turned away before the first light inside the church was switched on, because to her, the thought that some child would lift that violin and draw from it one complete melody was meaning enough, and she didn't need anyone to know whose hands had healed it. By the time she returned to the van as the sky began to brighten, there was a loaf of bread still warm on the step below the door, wrapped in a carefully folded sheet of brown paper. There had been no knock, no greeting, not even a scrap of paper. Maeve knew it was Mrs. Petra, the old woman who worked in the kitchen of the charity dining hall, the woman who'd never asked where Maeve lived, or why she always arrived earlier than everyone else and left later than everyone else, who simply placed something edible where Maeve would find it and then slipped away quietly, as though even a word of thanks might make someone feel they owed her something. Maeve lifted the loaf with both hands, feeling the last of its warmth seep through the paper into her numb fingers, and stood motionless beside the van in that silent morning. She didn't cry. She'd forgotten what crying felt like a long time ago, but she raised her head and looked toward the sky, where the gray was turning into a fragile wash of pink behind the rows of gravestones, and she told herself, as she told herself every morning, that she was still here, that she still had these hands, and that as long as she could still make something beautiful from things that had been broken, the world hadn't yet taken everything from her. A few miles from St. Bridget's Cemetery. Closer to the waterfront, as the last light of day withdrew from the river and turned the harbor cranes into broken black silhouettes, August Varley stood in the middle of an empty warehouse, with both hands in the pockets of his coat, silently watching the man before him. His name was Deacon. He had followed August for 9 years, long enough for August to know both his wife's name and the way he took his coffee, and that was precisely what made this evening heavier than any confrontation with a stranger. No one raised his voice. No one lifted a hand. The warehouse held nothing but the soft slap of water against the dock outside and the breathing of 2 men. August didn't wear a watch. He never had. But he possessed a sense of time more exact than any machine could measure, and he allowed the silence to stretch for exactly as long as Deacon needed to understand that everything had changed. At last August spoke, his voice even and low, almost gentle, the kind of voice those who had worked with him long enough had learned to fear, more than shouting. He asked Deacon whether he had taken money from an elderly woman who lived alone on the south side. Deacon didn't answer at once, and the hesitation itself was answer enough. August nodded slowly, then asked, still in that same terrifyingly calm voice, what the woman had owed him. Deacon opened his mouth, closed it again, then lowered his eyes to the concrete floor and quietly said that she hadn't owed him anything, that he had simply seen she lived alone, seen that she was weak, and seen that the money would be easy to take. August remained silent for a long time after that, long enough for Deacon to begin shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Then he told him that the woman was one of those who still came every week for lunch at the charity dining hall on Bishop's Row, that she had sat there eating the same soup in the same room where August himself sometimes sat, and that Deacon had taken the last few dollars from someone who had nothing left to lose. He said nothing more about it. He only told Deacon that there was a rule he had lived by for 12 years, a rule everyone who worked for him knew, that he never forced his way into another person's life, unless that person came to him and asked, because he had learned, at the highest price a human being could pay, that kindness imposed upon someone could be every bit as cruel as malice. But he also said, and this was where his voice dropped even lower, that there was another boundary, older than that rule itself, and no one who worked for him was permitted to take anything from people who already had nothing. Deacon looked up and tried to explain. He said that in 9 years he had never failed him, that he could return the money that very night, that the matter could be settled quietly. August listened to all of it without interrupting, then gave the slightest shake of his head. He told Deacon that returning the money wouldn't erase what he had chosen to do, that a man could give back the dollars, but could never give back the person he had become in the moment he decided to take them. Then August spoke his final sentence, brief and decisive as a door closing, telling him that from this moment on, Deacon owed him nothing, and that he should be out of the city before dawn. Deacon stood there a little longer, understanding that 9 years had just ended in a few quiet sentences, then turned and walked into the darkness beyond the warehouse doors, without another word. Only after the sound of his footsteps had disappeared completely did Rook, who always stood a few paces behind him, finally speak in the rough, weary voice of a man who had witnessed too many nights like this one. He didn't ask about Deacon. Instead, he asked August the question he had wanted to ask for years but had never dared, why every Tuesday morning he vanished from every meeting, every phone call, every person for exactly 1 hour, during which no one was allowed to follow him and no one was allowed to know where he went. August didn't turn to look at him. He stood there with his eyes fixed on the dark river, where the blurred lights of the harbor drifted away across the water, and through a silence so long that Rook thought he would never answer. He didn't say a single word. A few days after the night at the warehouse, on a Tuesday afternoon when the thin winter light spilled through stained glass windows, whose broken panes had been patched with clear tape, the door of the Bishop's Row Charity Dining Hall swung open, and Sloane Vance stepped into a world she had never entered before. She hadn't come out of compassion, nor for any noble reason people might assign to a woman walking into a place like this. She had come because a few days earlier, during an evening that had seemed ordinary, she had heard August mention the place where he disappeared every week, and she had caught a flicker in his eyes that she had never seen before. The possessive instinct inside her, sharpened by years spent in rooms where attention was the only currency that mattered, had scented something unusual. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. She crossed the room, heavy with the smell of onions and bleach, with the stride of a woman who knew exactly how beautiful she was and exactly how out of place she looked, the hem of her pale coat brushing past old aluminum tables. When a volunteer poured her a glass of water, she said thank you in the smooth, practiced voice she had perfected, but her eyes never once rested on the person's face, as though gratitude were something that could be bestowed upon empty air, without ever being offered to anyone at all. She found August at his usual corner table and sat across from him. As they talked, she noticed that his gaze occasionally slipped past her shoulder, toward a woman quietly wiping down tables at the far end of the room. The woman wore an old military jacket, her hair pulled tightly back, and she worked with a strange concentration, wiping each table as though it deserved to be cleaned, even though no one had asked her to do it. August watched her for longer than an ordinary glance, only half a second, but Sloane had spent her entire life learning how to read half-seconds like that, and something cold and sharp rose inside her chest. She stood, pretending she needed more water, and deliberately stepped into the narrow aisle, just as the other woman approached with a stack of bowls in her hands. Sloane planted herself directly in the middle of the way. She didn't yield. She didn't move. She simply stood there and stared. Maeve stopped, lowered her head slightly, murmured a quiet apology, then moved around her on the other side and continued on, without the slightest trace of irritation, without even a glance, like someone who had grown accustomed to making herself smaller so she could pass around obstacles other people had intentionally placed in her path. That calmness, that unguarded composure, only irritated Sloane more. She returned to the table, sat down, and without looking toward Maeve, deliberately raised her voice enough for it to carry through the quiet room. She said that some people in this world chose their own troughs, that not everyone who fell to the bottom had been pushed there by fate, and that pity was sometimes nothing more than nourishment for another person's laziness. A few heads at the nearby tables lowered closer to their bowls of soup. August didn't respond. He only set down his spoon, very gently, without making a sound, then straightened in his chair and looked at Sloane with an expression she couldn't read. One that held no anger but no longer contained even a trace of warmth. Yet in that moment, with all the confidence of someone who believed she was protected, she still thought his silence meant agreement. She believed that standing beside a powerful man like him meant she could say anything she wanted in any room she entered, because his power, in her mind, was a shield she had been given the right to wear. She had no idea that what she had just touched wasn't a shield but a code, and that she had just crossed its first boundary. At the far end of the room, Father Duras, the elderly priest who oversaw the place, had witnessed everything from the kitchen doorway. He waited until Maeve carried the stack of bowls inside, then gently drew her aside, and, in the quiet voice of a man who had watched too many things repeat themselves over the course of his life, told her to be careful around people who treated kindness like a competition. Because people like that could never bear to see someone else being good without expecting a reward. Maeve only smiled, thanked him, and said she had met people far more difficult than that. After that first Tuesday afternoon, Sloane began coming back, not often enough to attract attention, but regularly enough for her to tell herself that she was only stopping by chance, even though deep down she knew exactly why she came. She came to confirm something she still couldn't name, a small suspicion that had taken root from the fleeting moment. August's gaze slipped past her shoulder, and each time she entered the room steeped in the smell of onions. She watched him with the sharp sensitivity of someone who had spent her entire life measuring how much or how little she was being seen. The strange thing was that August, from the moment she began appearing there, seemed to look less and less toward the far end of the room, where Maeve continued quietly doing her work, and he did it consciously, with discipline, like a man locking himself away from something within his own reach. But Sloane didn't read that restraint as restraint. She read it as concealment. The more she saw him avoid looking at the other woman, the more certain she became that something was being hidden, because in the world where she had grown up, people only turned their faces away from what they wanted too badly to see. And so the cuts began, so small they were almost invisible, so subtle that no one could point to them and give them a name. A glance held a little longer than necessary when Maeve passed by, a quiet sigh shaped like pity. A sentence left unfinished, released into the air and allowed to fall where it would, like the day Sloane stood near the water counter and watched Maeve's hands arranging the napkins, then remarked, not quite to anyone, that it was such a waste for hands that beautiful to have come to this. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. She left the words hanging there and walked away, knowing they would find their way to where they were meant to go. Maeve heard them. She always heard. But she didn't stop working, didn't lift her eyes, and simply continued folding the napkins into perfectly even squares. Because she had learned long ago that the only way to strip words like those of their power was to refuse to let them see how deeply they had reached. That night, when she returned to the van behind St. Bridget's Cemetery, and the flashlight once again cast its familiar pale yellow glow against the ceiling, Maeve sat for a long time without doing anything at all. Then she raised both hands into the light and opened them slowly, looking down at her palms as though she were studying the map of another life. These were the hands that had healed hundreds of instruments, rebuilt shattered curves, and restored music to pieces of wood that had seemed condemned to silence forever, and Sloane had called them wasted. But as Maeve looked at them in the darkness, she didn't think about Sloane, and she didn't think about the violins. She thought of something else. Something she wouldn't allow herself to name, because on nights like this, those hands still seemed to remember what it had felt like to be small enough, gentle enough, to cradle something so tiny that there was nowhere else in the world for it to rest except inside her palms, and now they held nothing at all. She closed both hands into fists, so tightly that her knuckles turned white, then slowly released them, and she switched off the flashlight so she wouldn't have to look at them anymore. Across the city, in a room high above the harbor lights, August was still awake as well. He had seen Sloane that day. He had seen the way she released those words when she believed no one truly cared enough to notice, had seen the small and graceful cruelty hidden beneath her polished surface reveal itself at the exact moment she thought no one was watching, and he had said nothing. He sat there with the silence of a man bound by his own code, the rule he had built out of blood and loss, the rule that told him he had no right to enter another person's life, unless that person came to him first, and Maeve Donnelly had never asked him for anything, just as she had never asked anything of anyone. A few days later, on a gray afternoon just as Maeve stepped out through the side door of the church with a mop bucket in her hand, she saw a man waiting at the edge of the courtyard, and for a moment the entire world seemed to stop around her. It was Corbin. He wore a new, neatly pressed shirt, the kind she knew he had bought for some important occasion, and he stood there with the awkward posture of a man who had come to take something away while trying to make it look as though he were giving. He called her name softly, almost tenderly, and began with an apology, saying that he knew he had no right to appear like this, that it had taken him some time to find her. But even as the words left his mouth, his eyes slipped past her shoulder and came to rest on the old van parked out of sight behind the trees at the edge of the cemetery. And in that fleeting glance, Maeve read everything he didn't say, the pity, the relief that his own life hadn't turned down this road, and something faintly resembling disgust. He drew a neatly folded stack of papers from inside his coat and explained, in the voice of a man who had rehearsed every line, that he was about to begin again, that he had met someone, that they intended to marry, and that in order to do so he needed her to sign these papers, because in the eyes of the law they had never truly ended. They had simply ceased to exist in each other's lives, from the day he walked out the door and never came back. Maeve looked down at the papers, then lifted her eyes to his face, the face of the man she had once loved, once trusted, once placed an entire life into the hands of, and she felt no anger, which was the most frightening part of all. She felt only a vast and silent emptiness. She took the pen he held out to her, but before she lowered it to the page, she looked up and asked him one question in a voice so calm that even she was surprised by it. She asked whether he knew what the baby's name had been. Corbin went still. He opened his mouth, and for 1 second something passed through his eyes, a calculation, an effort to remember. Then he closed his mouth again without producing a sound, because he didn't know. He had never known. Maeve nodded slowly, like someone confirming something she had understood for a very long time, but still needed to hear answered by silence one final time. Then she told him quietly that the baby's name had been Rosalind, that she had been with Maeve for 19 days, that he had come back just as she was born, had stayed for 4 days, then had walked away on the 4th day and never looked back. She didn't say those things to accuse him, nor to punish him. She spoke them the way someone lays down a burden carried for far too long, one word at a time, slowly and clearly, and each word fell into the space between them like a stone dropping into dark water. Corbin couldn't speak. He lowered his eyes to the damp concrete, and perhaps in that moment he understood something about himself that he would carry for the rest of his life. But it was too late, and they both knew it. Maeve bent down, braced the papers against her knee, and signed her name on the blank lines, in handwriting that remained strangely beautiful and steady, the handwriting of someone accustomed to doing things properly, even while her heart was breaking apart. She folded the papers, handed them, and the pen back to him. Then, without waiting for him to say another word, lifted the mop bucket and went back inside the church, where she began wiping down the long tables with quiet composure, as though nothing at all had happened. Across the street, inside a car hidden beneath the trees, August had watched the entire scene through the window. He couldn't hear a single word, didn't know who the man was, didn't know what the papers were, and saw only a woman sign something, then stand motionless in the fine rain for exactly 30 seconds before turning back inside to continue working. Rook, seated behind the wheel, quietly asked whether August wanted him to find out who the man was. August remained silent for a while, his eyes still following the small figure, bent over a table beyond the clouded glass. Then he shook his head and said softly that there was no need, that she hadn't asked anyone for anything. Maeve's life, the part no one at Bishop's Row ever saw, was woven from small, silent jobs she took on to gather every stray dollar she could. Some mornings, she went to a center on the south side to donate plasma, sitting in a cold vinyl chair with one arm stretched out, staring up at the stained ceiling while she waited, then walking away with a small slip of paper worth a few $dozen and a wave of dizziness she had taught herself to ignore. Some afternoons she stopped by a pawn shop on the corner, where the owner knew she had gifted hands and gave her old guitars no one had ever come back to claim, with loose strings, warped necks, and worn frets, so she could repair them well enough to be sold. He paid her $30 for each one, a price they both knew was shamefully low compared with the labor she put into them. But she never bargained, because she needed every dollar and couldn't afford the luxury of pride. At the end of each month, beneath the flashlight's glow inside the van, she spread those crumpled small bills across her lap and counted them twice, then 3 times, until she was certain, smoothing each one flat before placing them inside an envelope. On the front, in her careful handwriting, she wrote a single name, Fionn. Fionn was her younger brother, 8 years her junior, and between them lay a hollow that life had carved out when they were still children, because in the year their father died, when she was 14 and the boy was only 6, the 2 orphans had been taken away in different directions, the little boy sent to a family kind enough to raise him well, while she drifted from one home to another. They had grown up apart, becoming 2 near strangers bound by the same blood, and now, as adults, Maeve quietly sent him money every month as a way of making amends for all the years she hadn't been able to stand beside him, all the years she hadn't been the sister he should have had. Fionn believed his sister managed a violin workshop in Portland, that she had a steady and respectable life, and she let him believe it, because she would rather die than let him know the truth about where she lived. Every Sunday afternoon, she stood beneath the church awning, where the rain striking the metal roof and the traffic echoing from the street blended into a kind of noise she could pretend came from a busy office, and she called him. That day, Fionn eagerly told her about the grade he had received on his latest exam, his voice alive with energy and hope through the phone, the very life she had sacrificed so much to preserve in him, and she laughed, a real laugh, standing there in the cold rain with water soaking through her shoes, and told him that she was doing wonderfully, that everything there was fine, that he mustn't worry about her. But this month, plasma donations and old guitars still weren't enough to fill the envelope. There was a gap she had no way to cover, and so one morning, she did the thing she had sworn to herself she would never do. From the bottom of her cloth bag, where she had kept it for all these years, she took out a small wooden clamp, darkened by time, the one her mother had once used to hold a violin neck steady while the glue was still drying, the only thing left of the woman who had died when Maeve was 9. The thing she had clutched through one foster home after another, through a broken marriage, through the night she lost everything, through 4 years of sleeping in a broken van. For 18 years, she had never once let it leave her. She carried it to the pawn shop and placed it on the glass counter, and when the owner slid a few bills and a small receipt toward her, she understood that she wasn't selling an object. She was selling 18 years of her life. She took the money, nodded, and walked out of the shop without daring to look back, and in her haste the fragile receipt slipped from her trembling fingers and fell onto the damp sidewalk just outside the door. She never noticed. She was already gone. A few minutes later, a broad-shouldered man named Rook happened to pass by, stopped, bent down, and picked up the small piece of paper. Then came the day Sloane decided to turn that humble room into a stage of her own. She called it a charity luncheon, an event, and she prepared for it with all the meticulous care of someone who understood that an image could be arranged. She had the old, yellowing light bulbs replaced with warmer ones, borrowed white cloths to spread over several of the aluminum tables, invited 2 reporters along with a handful of familiar faces from her social circle, people who would witness and preserve the sight of a beautiful and generous woman bestowing kindness upon the unfortunate. She arrived with the confidence of someone certain she was protected, certain that beneath the shadow of August's power she could do anything she pleased in any room without ever paying a price, and she had no idea that this very belief was the noose she was placing around her own neck. It was raining that afternoon, and water blowing through the gap beneath an old door had left a damp stain across the tile near the narrow aisle between 2 rows of tables. Maeve, as always, was carrying a tray of hot soup out from the kitchen, and when she stepped onto that wet patch, the worn sole of her shoe slipped. Before she could catch herself, the tray tilted out of her hands and came crashing down, splashing soup across the spotless white hem of Sloane's dress as she stood nearby. The entire room fell silent for a second, but Sloane didn't scream. That was the most frightening part. She looked down at the stains spreading across her dress, then raised her head and smiled, a flawless, practiced smile directed toward the two reporters, as though reassuring them that everything remained under control, that this was only a minor inconvenience. Then she turned back to Maeve, and that smile was still on her lips when she uttered a single word, softly and sharply as a thin blade, telling her to kneel. Maeve was already on her knees. She had dropped to the tile from the very first moment to gather the broken pieces and wipe away the spreading soup, because that was what she had intended to do. But Sloane wasn't finished. She slowly bent down, picked up a piece of bread soaked through from the puddle on the floor, pinched it between two fingers tipped with dark wine-colored nails, and held it out before Maeve's face. In the same voice, still so sweet it was chilling, she said that if this woman had come here to eat, then she should eat, that she should eat it right there where she belonged. 20 people in the room lowered their faces. Not one of them spoke. Maeve knelt there with her head bowed, and she kept it lowered not only because of the humiliation, but for another reason known only to her, because she had recognized the man sitting at the corner table, had recognized him months ago, and now the only thing she had left was the fragile hope that he wouldn't recognize her, that he wouldn't see that the woman who had once healed an instrument for him years before had now become the thing kneeling on the floor. Her trembling fingers rose and nearly touched the piece of bread, and she felt the warmth still lingering in it, warmer than she had expected, and in that moment something broke inside her that no one else could see. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and there was one very small, very deep part of her, the part 4 years on the streets had created, the part she despised more than anything else in the world, and that part looked at the bread and felt hunger. Inside her coat pocket, the envelope holding Fion's money rustled softly whenever she moved, reminding her that if she resisted, if she stood and walked away, she would lose the meals she received here, and then she would have to tear open that envelope. And that was what Sloane took from her in that moment, not her dignity, because dignity was something no one could take unless she surrendered it, but something else, something far crueler, the right not to feel hungry when looking at a piece of bread on the floor, the right to remain the person she had once been before the world, taught her body what deprivation meant. Tears rose hot in her eyes, but she wouldn't allow them to fall, and she held her hand suspended in the air, neither drawing it back nor reaching forward. Through a moment that seemed to last forever while the entire room appeared to stop breathing with her. And then, at the corner table where he had always sat, August Varley rose to his feet. He didn't stand abruptly, didn't shove back his chair, didn't make a sound, yet the entire room felt the movement before their eyes had time to see it. The way people sense a change in the pressure of the air before a storm. One by one, the faces that had been lowered began to lift, and a different kind of silence spread through the room. The silence of people who had suddenly realized who the quiet man who sat among them eating soup every week truly was. In the moment he stepped away from that table, something inside him shattered as well. Because for 12 years he had lived by an iron rule, the rule that said he mustn't enter anyone's life unless he was asked. And now, in this very second, he understood that the rule he had once built to honor someone who was gone had nearly turned him into one of the 20 people with their heads bowed, people who had sat still and watched a woman be driven down onto the floor without a single one of them moving, exactly as an entire room had once sat in silence while another woman, long ago, slowly faded away in neglect. And he understood that there were moments when obeying one's own laws was itself a form of cowardice. He walked forward, and he did the one thing no one in the room expected. He knelt down, right there in the soup still spreading across the tile, dressed in his expensive charcoal gray suit, lowering himself until he was level with Maeve, and he reached out and gently took the broken piece of tray from her trembling fingers. She looked up at him, and in the gaze they exchanged there was something no one else in the room could read. Then he spoke to her in a voice so quiet that she alone could hear him clearly, telling her to stand, not because he was asking her to, but because she had never, not even for a single moment, belonged in that place on the floor. He helped her to her feet. Then he straightened, turned his back on Sloane, and faced the 20 people who remained frozen in their chairs, and he began to speak, not loudly, but with such clarity that every word seemed carved into the air. He said that he had once known a woman, someone who had died in a place not unlike this room, alone and forgotten, and that on that day there had also been a room full of people sitting there, and not one of them had stood up for her. He didn't say who the woman was. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was so heavy that the rain striking the roof could be heard. Sloane stood there with soup staining her white dress, while the eyes of the reporters she herself had invited were now fixed upon her, and she tried to recover. Her voice had begun to tremble as she said that she had only been trying to help these people, that she was doing something good. August turned to look at her, and he answered in the calm voice that stripped away every possible path of retreat, telling her that she hadn't helped anyone at all, that she had only put them on display, and that between genuinely helping another human being and turning that person into a backdrop for one's own image lay a distance so vast that she had fallen into the middle of it, without ever realizing. She opened her mouth to say something more about standards, about appearances, about all the things she had worshipped throughout her life, but no words came, because in his eyes she saw something she had never seen during the 14 months she had spent beside him, an absolute finality. He reached into his coat pocket, took out the key to the apartment he had bought for her, and placed it on the table covered in white cloth, not tossing it, not throwing it, only setting it down softly, the way someone closes a door he knows will never open again. Then, without looking at her anymore, he said that Rook would take her home, and that she was never to return to this place again. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when August's car moved slowly through the rain-soaked, deserted streets of the East Side, the streetlights casting bands of yellow across the window that stretched and vanished over his motionless face. Rook sat behind the wheel with both hands resting on it, and he had remained silent for a long stretch of the drive, the silence of a man weighing whether to say aloud what both of them already knew had to be said. At last he spoke, his voice rough and low, not looking toward August but staring straight ahead through the windshield into the darkness. He said that the woman, Sloane, had been at his side for 14 months, that she knew names, knew numbers, knew even the docks and shipments no outsider should ever have been allowed to know about. He said that someone like her, once wounded and cast aside, once her pride had been crushed in front of an entire room, would sooner or later open her mouth. August didn't turn his head. He kept looking out the window as the dark storefronts drifted backward past them, and he said only one short sentence, very softly, that he knew. Rook allowed the answer to settle for a while, then asked again, carefully, in the manner a man in his position asked questions like this, questions that were never spoken by their true names, whether August wanted him to ask about it one more time. A dense silence filled the car. 30 seconds passed, as long as 30 minutes, with only the sound of the tires moving over the wet road and the windshield wipers sweeping steadily back and forth. August knew exactly what Rook was asking. He was asking whether August wanted this problem resolved in the way every problem in their world had always been resolved, the way a single nod from him would be enough to make a person disappear from the city forever. And during those 30 seconds, a very old, very deep part of August, the part that carried his father's blood, rose inside him and whispered that this was simple, that his father would settle matters like this before breakfast, cleanly, decisively, without leaving a single loose thread behind. His father had been a man who never hesitated, and that lack of hesitation had planted a fear in August's childhood that he had never fully managed to cast off, a fear that still found him in his dreams, where he saw that man's shape again and woke with the cold realization that perhaps he wasn't so different from him after all. But August wasn't his father. He had spent his entire adult life proving that, not to the world but to himself, by removing violence from the kingdom he had inherited instead of adding more, by drawing boundaries his father had never possessed, by refusing again and again the easy and brutal road his own blood never stopped calling him toward. And so, when those 30 seconds finally passed, he didn't nod. He only said, in the even and weary voice of a man who had just won a battle no one else in the car could see, that he had heard him. That was all. He had heard him, Rook, and Rook, who had walked beside him long enough to understand every layer of meaning beneath his few words, didn't ask a third time. He didn't need to. August's silence after that sentence was the whole answer, absolute and final, that no matter how high the cost of mercy might be, no matter how much damage that woman might still cause, neither his hands nor the hands of any man who served him would ever touch her. Rook gave a small nod to himself in the darkness, turned the car onto the road leading home, and neither man spoke another word for the rest of the journey. What happened at Bishop's Row that day didn't remain contained within the four walls of the charity dining hall for long, because in the world of men like August, a moment of vulnerability exposed in front of reporters was no different from blood spreading through water, and there were always predators waiting to catch its scent. Only a few days later, his phone rang, and on the other end was the voice of Osgood Trant, a man who controlled the docks on the north side, someone with whom August had preserved peace for years through a cold and carefully measured respect. Trant's voice carried mockery, clumsily concealed beneath a layer of familiarity. He said that people all across the city were talking about how the great Varley boss had knelt down to wipe a floor in his expensive suit, all for a homeless woman, and in a voice sweet as honey, he asked whether August was beginning to grow soft. August listened until he had finished without interrupting, then answered in the calm voice that had become his signature, telling him that as of that morning, Trant no longer had the right to set foot on Dock 9, the dock he had always depended upon to move his shipments, and August ended the call before the man could utter another word. It was a decisive blow, and it ignited exactly what August knew it would. Trant declared war, not with bullets, but with the weapon men like him preferred, money and influence. Within a single week, 3 major transportation contracts that should have gone to August were suddenly blocked by invisible hands. Old partners began avoiding his calls, and more painfully than anything else, 3 of the men who had once followed him quietly came to resign, because they could sense the wind changing, and didn't want to stand beside a man they believed had begun to weaken. August accepted every loss without revealing the slightest emotion, because he had known the price from the moment he rose from that corner table, and he had chosen to pay it. During those same days, one afternoon, August personally took Maeve to a place she had never seen before, an old workshop tucked into a quiet corner of the east side. A building that many years earlier had been a woodworking and instrument repair shop. He pushed open the weathered wooden door, and inside was a spacious room with tall windows that caught the afternoon light, plain brick walls, and a long, sturdy workbench standing in the middle. As though it had been waiting all this time for a pair of hands to return, Maeve remained at the threshold, unable to bring herself to step fully inside, and when she understood what he intended, she shook her head. He told her that this wasn't a gift, that he had no intention of giving her anything out of charity, that she would pay him rent for the place every month, regularly, just like anyone else, because he didn't want her to owe him any gratitude at all. Then he added quietly that gratitude was the worst debt of all, something that bound people more tightly than money ever could. But Maeve still refused. She said she couldn't accept it, that she wasn't accustomed to taking things she hadn't earned, and she turned him down once, then twice, then 3 times, each refusal more resolute than the last, because her pride was the final stronghold she still possessed, and she wouldn't allow it to collapse even in the face of kindness. August listened until she had finished without showing the slightest impatience, then looked directly into her eyes and said something that made the entire world around her seem to stop. He told her that she had already earned this place, that she had earned it long ago, through 9 unbroken months, every morning at 5 o'clock, when she quietly left healed instruments on the church steps and walked away without waiting for a single word of thanks. Maeve completely still. She stood there unable to speak, because she had believed that through all those months no one had ever seen her, that she had been perfectly invisible, and yet this man had known, had always known, from the very beginning. While she was still lost in that shock, he pointed toward the workbench, where a completely new box of tools had already been placed, the finest instruments money could buy, the kind she had once dreamed of but had never dared to own. She walked toward it slowly and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among gleaming carving knives and brand new files, lay one small old object that seemed utterly out of place beside everything else, a wooden clamp darkened by the years. It was the one, her mother's wooden clamp. Maeve reached out with trembling fingers and lifted it, and the moment she touched the familiar wood, worn smooth with age, a wall she had spent years building inside herself, suddenly broke apart. August had no idea what the object was. He didn't know who it had belonged to, didn't know that it carried 18 years of a life within it. He had simply taken from Rook a pawnshop receipt found on the sidewalk, and with the instinct of a man who had seen too much, he had understood that someone only sold something so small, so old, and worth so little when there was nothing else left to sell. So he had quietly redeemed it, asking no questions, making no inquiries, and placed it inside the toolbox as though returning a broken piece to the place where it belonged. Maeve turned the wooden clamp over in her palm, rotating it slowly, studying the scratches she had known by heart since childhood, and then she couldn't hold herself together any longer. She collapsed over the workbench, her shoulders shaking, and she wept for the first time after so many years of having forgotten what it felt like to cry, not from pain, but because for the first time in a very long life, someone had returned to her something she had believed was lost forever. A few days after Maeve had begun to settle into her new life at the workshop, one afternoon, a luxury car stopped outside, and Sloane stepped out. She didn't come to apologize. People like her didn't know how. She stood there, still flawless from her hair to the heels of her shoes, and looked at Maeve with an expression mingling contempt and something close to desperation. Then asked bluntly what this woman had done to make August look at her that way. Because she, Sloane, had spent 14 long months at his side and had never once received a look like that. Maeve stopped working, turned, and studied her for a long moment before answering in a gentle voice without the slightest trace of triumph, saying that if she truly couldn't understand the answer, then that failure to understand was the entire answer. Sloane stood motionless for a moment, and Maeve's words slid over her like water over glass, unable to sink in, because there was no place within her capable of holding an idea like that, and she would never understand. That was her true punishment, one heavier than poverty or disgrace. She turned and walked away, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and an emptiness. But while those hidden currents were closing around August, something quiet and strange was unfolding at Bishop's Row. Mrs. Petra, the elderly woman who still left loaves of bread behind, had watched him for months whenever he came to sit at the corner table. And one afternoon, when the light fell across his face at a certain angle, memory suddenly broke open inside her. More than 20 years earlier, when she had worked as a cook in a shelter in Providence, she had cared for a frail and lonely woman named Cordelia, had sat beside her through her final nights, and now she recognized that the quiet man who came to eat soup every week was the son Cordelia had spoken of in her delirium. And Mrs. Petra knew something he had never known through all those years, the place where his mother had been buried. During the first days Maeve worked in that workshop, as she slowly grew accustomed to the afternoon light pouring through the tall windows and to the stillness she hadn't possessed in a very long time, she began cleaning and arranging the space, as though she wanted to understand every corner of the place that had taken her in. One afternoon, while wiping down the long workbench, she noticed that one of the drawers beneath it felt somehow different, its bottom shallower than the depth suggested from the outside, and when she reached inside, her fingers touched a loose panel fitted so precisely that it was almost invisible, the kind of thing only someone determined to hide something would think to make. She pried it up, and beneath it, inside the narrow darkness, lay an old tin box rusted at the corners. She lifted it out, set it on the table, and opened the lid. There was no money inside, no gold or silver, only the fragments of a life. There was a handful of old wood shavings and small violin pegs in different sizes, dulled by time, remnants of the trade the former owner had practiced in this room. There was an old black-and-white photograph of a master and his apprentice, faded and blurred almost beyond recognition, showing a young man standing beside a woman, holding an instrument in her arms, though the image had worn away so badly that the woman's face had become little more than an indistinct patch of light. And at the bottom of the box was a small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth, and as Maeve turned through its pages, she realized it was a ledger of debts, but it was unlike any debt ledger she had ever seen. In the trembling handwriting of old age, the former owner had written down the names of customers who owed him money, the shoes he had repaired without being paid, and beside each name there were no threats, no angry underlined figures, only small, compassionate notes saying that one person was unemployed, another had young children, another had promised to pay the following month. It was the ledger of a man who had extended credit again and again, and had never truly gone after anyone for what he was owed. Maeve sat motionless for a long time with that notebook in her hands, and little by little she pieced the story together. She understood that the former owner of the workshop, a man named Ansel Pruitt, had been so kind that his kindness itself had ruined him, a man crushed by the cold machinery of loans and lenders until he lost everything, even the place that had been tied to his entire life. And when she looked into that ledger, she didn't see a stranger. She saw another version of herself, someone who had tried to do everything decently and had still lost it all. She couldn't stay. She knew she couldn't. The very next morning, she took the workshop key to August, placed it on the table before him, and told him that she couldn't stand and work on another man's floor, on the ground from which a decent person had been driven away. August frowned and said that the man had borrowed money and failed to repay it, that this was how things worked, that there was nothing unjust about it. Maeve looked at him and answered quietly, without wavering, that she knew he had borrowed the money and hadn't paid it back, and she still couldn't do it. And in that moment, something rare happened. August truly became angry for the first time in many years, not because she was ungrateful, but because she was right, because she had touched the exact place where his own conscience had already been aching, and because in 12 years not one person, not a single soul in his entire kingdom, had ever dared stand upright before him and tell him that he was wrong. He snatched up the key and hurled it against the brick wall, the sharp clang of metal splitting the room. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her, no longer angry, but carrying an absolute weight. He told her that she was not allowed to run away, that the workshop would remain locked to the world until he resolved the matter with Ansel Pruitt himself, and he demanded she stay there to witness the end of it. He picked the key up off the floor and pressed it back into her palm. Then, he dropped heavily into the chair, clasped his hands together, and sat there for a long time in silence without saying another word. The following morning, August drove out of the city alone, without Rook, without anyone, traveling the long road back to Providence, where Mrs. Petra had quietly shown him where his mother lay. He arrived at a public cemetery on the edge of town, the kind reserved for people who died unclaimed, unmourned, without enough money for a proper place to rest. There were no stone markers engraved with names, no flowers, no words of remembrance, only a level field of grass stretching into the distance with small metal plaques set close to the ground, and on each plaque there was nothing but a number. He walked along those rows until he found the number Mrs. Petra had read to him. Then he stopped. He stood there, the man an entire city had learned to fear, standing silently before a nameless piece of metal planted in the grass. And he said nothing. He didn't pray, didn't weep, didn't explain. He simply stood with his arms hanging at his sides, his head bowed toward the number that had replaced the name of the woman who had given him life, for so long that his shadow shifted across the grass, and inside that silence were all the things he had never been able to say to anyone. At last, he took out his phone and called Rook. He didn't explain where he was or what he had just done. He only said in a low and steady voice that Rook was to find a man named Ansel Pruitt and give the shop back to him. On the other end of the line, Rook was silent for a moment, then said that the elderly man had been drowning in a long-standing debt of $4,800 that he was now too old to pay. August looked out across the vast cemetery before him and said that he knew how much the man owed, that he hadn't asked about that. He had only asked whether Rook could find him. There was a brief pause, then Rook's voice came quietly through the phone, saying, "Yes, sir." And it was in that moment, standing in the middle of a nameless cemetery, where no one could see him, that August Varley truly changed, not in the second when he rose before a crowded room, but here, where his kindness couldn't earn him a glance or a word of praise, where he gave simply because it was the right thing to do. During those same hours, in the workshop across the city, Maeve took out the tin box once again, because something in the blurred wedding photograph had continued to haunt her, calling her back. She carried it to the window, held it beneath the harshest afternoon light, and tilted it slowly from side to side, trying to see through the fading of the years. The woman in the photograph was holding an instrument in a very particular way, with a placement of the hands against its body that Maeve recognized at once, because it was exactly how she had always held one, a posture no one had ever taught her, a posture that had lived in her blood. Her heart began to pound. She looked more closely at the figure, at the hair, at the tilt of the head, and then the world around her seemed to collapse, because the young woman smiling in that wedding photograph, the woman holding the instrument beside the young luthier, was her mother. Ansel Pruitt, the former owner of this workshop, the kind man who had been crushed by the world, was the first master luthier who had taught her mother the art of shaping wood when she was still a girl, long before she joined the orchestra, long before she gave birth to Maeve. The workshop Maeve had just refused, the floor she had said she couldn't stand upon, was the place where her family's story had begun. She had been standing in the room where everything started without ever knowing it. Corbin returned a second time late one afternoon, but this time there was none of the awkward uneasiness he had carried before. In its place was the desperate agitation of a man driven into a corner and forced to do something even he despised. What Maeve didn't know and wouldn't understand until much later was that Corbin hadn't come to her on his own. Osgood Trant, while searching every corner for a weakness in August, had traced the woman working in the old shop and had also found her former husband, a man drowning in debt, and Trant had erased every dollar Corbin owed in exchange for one thing, that he make Maeve leave August, disappear, and humiliate the powerful man one more time. And so Corbin stood there in the workshop that had once belonged to her mother's teacher, and he began to blackmail her. He said that unless she gave him $400 every month, he would find Fionn and tell him the entire truth, that his sister wasn't managing an instrument workshop in Portland at all, that she had spent 4 years living in a broken van behind a cemetery, and that every dollar of his tuition had come from her blood and from the things she had sold. The figure of $400 was cruelly precise, because Corbin had once lived with her long enough to know that it was almost exactly the final limit of what she could endure without collapsing completely. And there is no cruelty more refined than the cruelty of someone who once loved us and knows exactly how much we can bear. Maeve looked at him, and she didn't beg or argue. She quietly walked to the place where she kept everything she possessed, took out $200, all the money she had saved, and placed it in his hand, telling him quietly that this was all she had for now, and she would find a way to pay the rest later. Not because she feared for herself, but because she would rather give away everything than allow any voice to shatter the pure and hopeful world she had built for her brother. But some things can't remain hidden in darkness forever. Through methods of his own, Rook tracked Corbin down, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, he brought the man to the workshop, where August was waiting. The moment Corbin crossed the threshold, saw August, and understood who that quiet man truly was, understood whose fury he had unknowingly invited by blackmailing this woman, his knees gave way, and he collapsed onto the concrete floor, not because anyone forced him down, but because pure terror had drained every trace of strength from his body. He looked up with a face gone white, his hands trembling, and stammered that he hadn't wanted to do this, that someone had forced him, that he was only a pawn in a game he didn't understand. And at that exact moment, Maeve entered. She stood in the doorway and saw the man who had once been her husband, the man who had walked away on the 4th day, kneeling at the feet of the man for whom her heart had only just begun to stir. She could have left him there on his knees. A very human part of her must have wanted to, but she didn't. She walked forward and, in a voice calm, gentle, and strangely steady, spoke the same 7 words another man had once spoken to her when she knelt on the church floor. "Stand up. No one has to kneel." Corbin lifted his head and stared at her in bewilderment, unable to understand why the woman he had just threatened was the one offering him her hand, and in her eyes there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only something that had been healed and was now quietly carrying out its work. August watched, and he let Corbin go without laying a finger on him, allowing him to walk out the door carrying the full terror of what might have happened. And that was precisely the message August intended to send back to Osgood Trant. But there was one thing Maeve would never know. From the name of the school Rook had forced out of Corbin, August quietly paid every remaining dollar of Fionn's tuition in full, anonymously, leaving behind no trace at all, so the young man could continue on his path, without ever knowing who had silently cleared the thorns from the road ahead. When the last hidden currents finally settled, Maeve's life slowly began to take on a new shape, and one of the first things she did was open a free violin class for the children of Bishop's Row, right there in the room where everything had once begun. Her first student was little Tilly, Rook's daughter, a girl with bright eyes and an eagerness nothing could extinguish. That lesson was filled with afternoon sunlight pouring through the tall windows. and when Tilly drew the bow across the strings for the first time, the sound came out so shrill and off-key that the child herself burst into laughter, a clear, ringing laugh that filled the room, and Maeve laughed with her, then gently stepped closer, placed Tilly's small fingers back in the proper position on the neck, and showed her how to hold the bow steadily, until the whole room was overflowing with the uncertain music of beginners and the sound of laughter, a kind of music more beautiful than any flawless performance. In the last row, sitting quietly in the shadows, August watched without saying a word, simply allowing the scene to sink into him. When the lesson ended and the children had chattered their way home, when the afternoon light began to turn the color of honey, Maeve sat down beside him, and in that warm stillness, for the first time, she told him about her daughter. She didn't speak of the illness or of the painful things. She only told him that in the room where she had stayed with the baby, there had been a clock on the wall, and it made one soft ticking sound every 4 seconds. She said she had lain there and counted those ticks through 19 nights, because as long as she kept counting, she didn't have to think, and that even now, she still couldn't sleep in a room that was completely silent. August didn't tell her he was sorry. He knew how empty those words were in the face of a loss like that. Instead, he simply remained beside her in silence until the sun had disappeared behind the rooftops and the room slowly sank into deep blue shadow. Then he gently asked her to tell him what song she had sung to the baby, and Maeve, touched by that question in a place no one had ever reached before, told him more than she had intended. She told him about the yellow wool blanket he had never known existed, the blanket she had begun knitting for her daughter, but the child had died before she could finish it. She said that ever since then, night after night, she had continued knitting, not because of hope, but because her hands needed something to do, something to hold on to so she wouldn't sink into her thoughts. And the blanket had kept growing longer and longer, until it was no longer truly a blanket at all, but something shapeless and never meant to be finished, because finishing it would mean she had to stop, and stopping was something she still couldn't do. August listened to all of it, and something tightened inside his chest. Then Maeve turned to look at him and told him one final thing, something she had carried within herself for months. She said she had recognized him from the very beginning, that many years earlier, when she was only 17 and a young apprentice, a man had brought her a cello, his mother's cello, broken so badly that no one else had dared attempt the repair, and she had fixed it, had spent an entire week bringing it back to life. She told him that she had saved an instrument no one else could save, admitting she had long believed he must have forgotten the girl he once met, only for his quiet gaze to prove her wrong. August looked at her, a quiet smile brushing his lips, and softly confessed that he had never forgotten that her hands were the very reason he had stepped into that dining hall 9 months ago. Maeve merely smiled, without the slightest trace of blame, and said that it was all right, that there were things in this world that only needed one person to remember. What she didn't know was that the cello still remained in his home even now, and had never broken again since that day, because the young woman who had repaired it years ago had done her work with such extraordinary care. A year had passed since that rainy afternoon at Bishop's Row, and August Varley's world had changed in a way no one in his circle had ever imagined. He sold Dock 9. Then quietly began dismantling the empire he had spent so many years building, not because he had lost, not because Trant or anyone else had defeated him, but because he had chosen for himself a smaller, lighter life, a life in which, for the first time in many years, he could lie down at night and sleep until morning without waking. Ansel Pruitt, the kind old craftsman, was given his shop back free of debt, and August allowed Maeve to continue working there, with her paying rent regularly. She paid every dollar in full, on time, without ever missing a cent, because now she stood on the very ground where her mother had once learned her craft, not as someone indebted to another person's kindness, but as someone continuing a current that had begun long before she was born. As for Sloane, when Trant spread rumors throughout the city in an attempt to destroy August's name, portraying him as a man who manipulated the vulnerable, one of the 2 reporters who had attended that luncheon published the entire truth. What no one expected was that Sloane herself had quietly sent that reporter a message, asking that the part where August knelt on the floor not be removed. She hadn't done it because she had forgiven him, nor because she had become a better person, and when someone asked her why, She answered in her familiar cold voice that she hadn't helped him at all. She simply didn't want to be the only person in that room who had done nothing, twice. Maeve's little workshop now had a name, painted modestly on the wooden sign above the door, Cordelia's. She had chosen the name herself without asking August, and on the day he saw it for the first time, he stood outside for a very long time before he could bring himself to step inside. There was no ring between them, no wedding, only a peaceful morning, a cup of coffee still sending steam into the air, and a newly repaired violin resting quietly on the table between them. And sometimes happiness was truly no more complicated than that. Somewhere else, Fionn had completed his studies with honors. He still believed his sister was doing well, still believed the gentle lie she had told him for so many years. But now, at last, that lie had become the truth. She really was all right. And once every month before dawn broke, Maeve still quietly placed a tuned and carefully polished instrument on the church steps, leaving no note and no name, so that some child she would never meet could lift it into their arms and discover a voice of their own. Because the truth is that a person's worth has never been measured by what they possess, but by what they manage to preserve inside their heart after everything has been taken away. And the way someone treats a person who can offer them nothing in return is the clearest reflection of who they truly are. Money can buy comfort, and power can buy obedience, but nothing in this world can purchase the moment when one human being chooses to stand up for a stranger. True kindness isn't measured by how much we give, but by whether we're willing to see another human being at all, even when the entire world has decided to turn away. There were 20 people in that room that day, but only one of them stood up, and if you had been there, sitting in one of those chairs, ask yourself which person you would been. If this story has touched a place deep within your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it, so that every day you can join us in listening to many more meaningful stories that move the human heart. We would truly love to know how today's story made you feel. So please don't hesitate to leave a comment and share the honest thoughts that come from deep within your heart, because every word you write is precious to us. We sincerely wish everyone listening to this story abundant health, a joyful life, serenity, and peace throughout every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.